So welcome to the panel on veteran identity. My name is Jim Craig at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and I'm going to moderate the panel. And I'm going to just read you the call for the panel and then our speakers. So what it means to be a veteran has varied across time, place, policy, and circumstance, yet the term is used liberally and rarely fully understood. This panel will explore some of the complexities of veteran identity as it is understood in current American culture, including who gets to, quote, own the definition, how perceptions of veteran identity are affected by gender, and who is allowed to claim that label. Our speakers today, and I'll list them in order, are Steve Wahle. He's a Ph.D. student at the University of South Carolina and also a former St. Louisan, maybe a future St. Louisan. Rebecca Burgess, the founder and principal of the Civil Mill Project. Scott Parrott, Ph.D. From the University of Alabama, and one of my dissertation students, Dale Mathis, registered nurse. He's a Ph.D. student here at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. We're going to go about 7 to 8 minutes, maybe, with each speaker. If we have 10 minutes allocated for everybody. So what I would like to do, if they do meet their time, they get some questions. If they don't meet their time, we're going to move on, and the questions have to be held to the end. So I'll keep the watch, and Steve, you're on.
Right on. Thanks, Jim. So I'll try to speed through this so that I can take questions or allow for more questions for everybody at the end. So we've been at war for just about 20 years. We haven't had any drafts, no war bond drives. There's been no rationing, and this is odd, especially for prolonged conflicts in our country. As a result, veterans are placed on a pedestal for one of two reasons, typically. One, because they're broken, or two, because they're heroes, sometimes both, but typically not at the same time. So when we look at social science research and the way that funding flows, the slant and the intention usually leans towards understanding deficits, right? So then we begin to frame veterans with a deficit. Also, what happens is there tends to be, and this was brought up in the earlier panel, a monolithic view of veterans. So everyone who's joined the military will always be a veteran, right? And usually that has impacts on the way that we do social science research in particular. So if you look at a lot of research on veterans, they're pulling from like school registration lists, people using the GI Bill or other VA benefits, or people who are VA consumers in some way, right? So you've raised your hand one time and said, I'm a veteran in this case. And then when we want to do research on veterans, we find those people most easily that way. There are some other ways that people have gone about doing it, but that's the typical way. So then we narrow the pool of people that we're investigating whenever we're investigating veteran issues or veteran things. So because most of this tends to, most of this research on veterans is about deficit or intervention or solving a problem, there tends to be this idea that there are veteran issues, right, that are specific only to veterans, unique only to people that were once in the military. However, it's not very clear that there even exists one thing that's only specific to veterans, right? We think about PTSD and the history of how that became a diagnosis and eventually included in the DSM. That was VA mental health professionals who eventually created vet centers and realized that there was no diagnosis that really captured what they were seeing from Vietnam veterans. And eventually they successfully advocated to create the PTSD diagnosis, which we still strongly associate with veterans, but we know that you could get in a car accident and have PTSD. You could have violent encounters in your life and never have been in the military and still experience PTSD. So there are these depictions of veterans broken by war, the service member who's just kind of wandering around trying to find their place in civilian life. And there's plenty of evidence against that narrative, right? That is the typical experience of veterans. Even research that supports that veterans are more engaged and more committed to interventions, whether that's mental health, physical health, or even socially, like trying to find jobs and things like that. So this war-ravaged veteran That narrative does create more resources, right? Those of you that have been around since 2001, right? You've seen the growth of large organizations, Wounded Warrior Project in particular, right? Just bringing in gobs of money. You couldn't get, paper towels or ketchup at the grocery store without seeing a Wounded Warrior logo on a bunch of stuff. So we think a lot about the social science research around veterans and solving veteran problems, especially in healthcare. But only about half of eligible veterans sign up for VA healthcare. And then the numbers of the people who actually show up every year as unique encounters at the VA drops off drastically. Also, this correlation between experience of war and being a veteran, that needs to be further investigated, because we know that about 25% of all living veterans in the United States served during peacetime. So even though veterans have a long history of chronicling, their experience and how that shaped them, all the way back to ancient times, we still focus on, the larger narrative in the media or in research. And what we're seeing right now with post 9/11 veterans in particular, there are books, there are social media conversations that are starting to address the different ways that they would prefer to be identified or summarized or not be portrayed at all, that are going on. But for the most part, academia hasn't really participated or investigated what's going on there. So there is a blind spot in social science research where we're focusing again on the deficits, and we're creating one narrative about veterans need X, or this thing is a veteran problem. Well, that creates a need for more research, which is in our case funded because we've been at war for 20 years, right? So in 2001, before September 11th, the VA budget was $48 billion. In 2021, that is up over 500% at $243.3 billion, right? So only 7% of the US population at all is considered a veteran. And only a small portion of those veterans are going to the VA, right? Now, because, there's been so much attention on this, and the VA wasn't ready for this prolonged conflict, as well as starting to address some unaddressed Vietnam era things, a lot of attention is given to these gaps in services for veterans, which then has created the sea of goodwill, as Admiral Mike Mullen calls it, right? So all these other organizations out there that are trying to solve veteran problems outside of government intervention. So what happens there is, again, to go back to my earlier point about who we consider a veteran and how we draw samples to understand the veteran experience. If we're only counting people, or for the most part in our research, we're only counting people that have identified for a specific reason as veterans, and we're going back to them and asking them, what does it mean to be a veteran, and are your needs being met? It skews our sample and our understanding of the phenomena that's going on. So I'm interested in examining this construct of veteran identity, or maybe even creating a construct of veteran identity, instead of just assuming that anybody who is in the military is indeed a veteran at whatever time that we're asking them about their experience. To understand, what is it like to be a veteran in the US? What's the process of choosing to present as a veteran in one situation versus another situation? And this isn't my term that I've come up with, but I wanted to bring it up because it came up in the earlier discussion about what to call this, and I refer to it as veterancy, the state of being a veteran. And I think there is a process that occurs that in some instances someone is a veteran, whereas in other instances they are not. And I'll stop there.
So we do have a little time. Well done. And I can open with a question, but does anyone else have one? Or do you want me to get something started? Yeah, go ahead, Tori.
Hi, thanks, Steve. So I like how you're basically allowing veterans to claim their own identities. Let me lower my hand. My stepbrother and I, we graduated high school together. We both went into the Marine Corps around the same time. I am so gung-ho about being a veteran. I wear my boots from boot camp still on campus. I wear them with pride, whereas my stepbrother, on the other hand, he just doesn't want to have that claim to fame as a veteran. We were both in the Air Wing. He just doesn't feel like he contributed to the mission, which I have my own reasons for saying like, yeah, you do. So I appreciate you saying, you know, as individuals, we are able to take that identity ourselves. But I also have a question. So I also work in the Veteran Center at UMSL. So there was a veteran, or not really a veteran. Okay, I won't say that. So this person went to boot camp and they were medically separated after 3 months, but before 6 months of like being in service. So medical separation, administrative separation. They have a DD 214 and they would be able to update it to a veteran status. And there is that aspect with DD 214s, like depending on what your discharge status is, you know, if they are able to claim that veteran status, like what kind of conversation do you think could be around that?
Well, so this is exactly, you know, the kind of, so this topic is my dissertation research, and these are the kind of people that I'm wanting to interview, right? I mean, it would be very easy to, again, go down to the VFW, to go maybe even to a farmer's market on a Saturday and just put up a sign and say, I want to talk to veterans. But I also know people that wouldn't be included in my study if I went about it that way, right? And so one thing that I'm struggling with as I put together like my recruitment materials is, how do I ask people about being a veteran without making presumptions that would then lead someone to disqualify themselves, even though they would qualify, right? So essentially, if you think you're a veteran, whether it's in a very narrow sense in a particular situation like accessing VA care, and that's the only time you identify with a veteran, cool. Then I want to understand that, and what does that mean for you? Because I think that there would likely be a difference, and this is further down the road research, when people throw a bunch of research money at me, is to go to countries that have socialized medicine, for example, and ask veterans there about what it means to be a veteran, right? Because there is a lot of capital that comes along with claiming that title, right? Even if you only do it in a narrow sense, like it sounds like what's going on with the person that you're talking about. So yeah, I think that's somebody that probably wouldn't be included in most research, right? To ask like, well, maybe you don't identify as a veteran, but some people would say that you're a veteran, and what do you think about that? And that's where it gets tricky.
So lines are always tough to draw because there's things on each side of the line. We're going to move on, and I do know there's two people who had at least their hands raised, Sharon and John. I've got your names written down, so you are not lost. What I'd like to do is ask Rebecca Burgess to take the floor, and we'd love to hear from you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us in this conversation and listen to us. I would say bloviate myself, but one of the difficult things about talking about veteran identity is there are so many avenues into the discussion, each one of which is just rich and full of history. There's a line I like to use. It's from a poem called "The Young British Soldier" by Rudyard Kipling. And it goes like this: I'll sing you a soldier as far as I may, a soldier that's fit for a soldier. Meaning that veterans, because they are, former soldiers, are made up of words, and the narratives that we use are both about interpretation and about relationships to experiences. And so there's a reason why literature is so important in understanding what it means to be a veteran, and why it gets quoted so often is because it has this interpretive moment. And it's not just words and images and media that give us this narrative. It's actually also political words, legislative words that give us this. So I would say that if you look at the long history of veterans, the word itself, veteran, is associated with soldiers only in the 16th century in an Italian, Spanish, French, kind of Latinate thing that happens. Of course, there's a lot of wars in that period, a lot of wars between those nations. And so there's an international kind of sense of identity, but then it gets diversified very much from there. Veterans are creatures, you could say, of their relationship to the state. to war, to politics, both during it, that's the experience, and then afterwards in terms of the post-war legislation that signifies them as a specific or a special group of people who are owed or who require certain things of the state. And they are therefore both creatures of emotion and also of some fear, meaning generosity and gratitude, but also concern about how they will reintegrate into society. Someone mentioned at the beginning of this, Wilbert Waller's mention of, or wondered whether the situation in Italy influenced his concern. And in fact, it did, because even as far back as Greece, when we first have kind of a state recognizing veterans, there's the understanding that when veterans come back from war, what is it that you do with them? If no veterans come back, you have no veteran problem. If they come back, then they have an activity that they engaged in for the state, and their big question is, what does it mean now? What do I mean to the state, and what does the state mean to me? What does politics mean to me? And so you can see after every great war, Rome has this problem as well. One of the huge social revolutions that happened after the great battle with Carthage were fomented by not just by veterans themselves, but by politicians using veterans to try and change the system, because they lacked a political voice as veterans, as former soldiers, and they required it and needed it. So I would say that you see that through most of history. And then you see around the Age of Enlightenment, around the discovery of America, two things come into play. One, a state recognition of benefits, of government benefits needed for soldiers. And this is the English Parliament passes the first law in the wake of the Spanish Armada. It's called the Act for the Relief of Soldiers in 1592. And that is the piece of legislation that influences the American colonists, and that influences not only the first Congress, but the Continental Congress to actually have legislation in place for pensions for wounded soldiers, to take care of not only them, but especially their widow and the orphan. So there's a long history in America that goes back prior to America about those political legislative concerns about what you do with veterans. I would say what America actually starts to add to the conversation is I would almost argue, is the invention of the veteran as an individual, and as a coherent group of society. So the question of where veteran fits in sociology and where they fit as an individual becomes first and foremost a question that the founders have to solve, because it influences how they're going to treat them legislatively. So for George Washington, when he's saying farewell to the Continental Congress, Army, sorry, he says, you will probably experience some envy, jealousy, distrust from the civilians, those who have not fought in this war, and you yourself might feel that way towards them. Basically, he says, let go of it. What you need to do is take all of the things that you have learned and your passion and your energy, and you need to use them to further yourself and this nation. And so explore in, economic discovery, in all of the other things that building a nation requires. And so you have the discovery of the Northwest Territory, right, which is incredibly influenced by veterans. And the whole settling of the West is, in one way, a very long history of veterans. Of course, it's not always an easy or a happy, bucolic, pastoral story. That fear, once again, I mentioned, of reintegrating soldiers into society as something that has occurred at the end of every single military conflict we have been involved with, and influenced as we get into post-Civil War, especially into World War I, World War II, the idea of kind of preempting some of those economic considerations and fears by vocational and GI educational benefits, so that they can either have a cooling off period and a new ways of identifying, but also help on the economic side without having too much of a glut of returning workers in the system and all of that. So you could say that there are about 7 or 8 different periods of the veteran in America. You have that founding period when veteran identity was supposed to be a character trait and an experience kind of on the rung of who you are. It's not supposed to be the be all end all. You're supposed to move forward with it. After the War of 1812, you have the idea of suffering soldiers and the idea that what they are owed for making this nation, kind of a rally around the veteran effect instead of a rally around the flag, but they're really identified as one, to bring forward a patriotism to fight this new war. With the Civil War, you get the idea for the first time that the experience of fighting war is a transformative experience for the individual involved, and that this is where you get the line from Oliver Wendell Holmes of baptism by fire, that war completely changes who you are, and that those who have been a part of it become distinct from the civilians that they then mingle with afterwards. And from there you get the kind of genre of war writing that happens, that influences World War I, that you really see in World War I. You also have the rise, and I know we'll hear more about this later, of war journalism and newspapers and photography that are able to actually portray soldiers and veterans, and the rise of railroads. Veterans are actually traveling across the country in many nations because many of them were given free railroad passes. They're participating in politics, so they become on the move and really, really in the public eye in ways that they weren't necessarily beforehand as a group. After World War II, Vietnam, of course, is often in all of our discussions about how that changed because of the social upheavals around war and anti-war and discoveries in medicine being, you could say, either conflicted or collided to further each other's aims. And then you have something that I think is not understood, especially amongst the public enough today, which is that post-Vietnam, we had the turn to the all-volunteer force. And so no longer was it young men or even young women who were serving and whose main role that was to be a person at a front line if needed. Suddenly you have the rise of military families because the military is a profession, and you have less than 1% of the nation serving. And you have 60% of those who are volunteering to serve coming from military families, which means that it means multiple things. It means, one, most of the nation has no idea what it means to serve. They don't know about the different branches of service. They don't know what the difference is between an officer and an enlisted and a non-commissioned officer. They have no idea that there are, 100 or so MOSs in the Army alone, that combat or combat veteran is now something that's very much defined by legalese and not necessarily by being on a front line or the position you were at in a front line. It's all conflated, I think, because of our legislation has more and more has grown to encompass all aspects of putting on a uniform and what that means in a volunteer force, having to incentivize it, having to properly repay it. And therefore we have what Steve was talking about, which is that anyone who puts on a uniform is now considered to be a veteran. This is a very uniquely American phenomena. Those who write in other countries don't necessarily talk about this, especially in Britain. If you ask, they have had some public polls done about who the public thinks a veteran is. They think of them as a World War II veteran, old and a pensioner. They do not think about them as a potential 30-year-old person, and therefore they do not think of those who serve in the military currently with much esteem, though they do have esteem for say, the World War II generation. America is very different. We do have difficulties, and I've written a lot about the problem with the broken veteran narrative, that veterans are social assets, but we do have also the reality that those who serve some of them are impacted negatively by their service, or they're triggered about prior things to it. But mostly, I would say what we've absolutely failed to talk about or to study is that if 60% of those who join the military today are from military families, it means there's a heightened sense of purpose and service that they are seeking. if you go into the military, which many do for that sense of identity and belonging of something larger than yourself, it means that on the back end, once you leave, that also you are going to, in a sense, have the deficit that much more than you normally would. And so the gap that needs to be filled is both much more potent, felt, and not addressed because we're not thinking in those terms. Um, and especially that comes to the fore, I think, in rise of suicidology that we see because of the corresponding lack of a strong identity. And that's a social wide thing. I think it's because our sense of citizenship itself has been, is not very strong. And so when veterans are connected with particular groups and senses of purpose where they feel that they have a voice, that what they did in the military was not for them only, but they can grow off of it and bring back into, that's where you start seeing these wonderful statistics about veterans being much more civically minded and giving back to their community, and the whole idea of second service, which we unfortunately do not also talk enough about, or we do not highlight even back to veterans, that this is something that they are uniquely qualified to do and have the capacity to do, and should be encouraged in doing. I'll stop there because I think I'm almost at my mark.
You are, yeah, you're there.
Okay,
There's
perfect.
so much that I have like 10 questions already for you.
Okay.
And I really like this term, creatures of the relationship with the state. I'm going to try to steal that somehow and write that into something I'm going to say. So I'll attribute it to you, Rebecca. So our next speaker is Scott Parrott at University of Alabama, and he's going to talk to us on media representations of veteran identity. Scott, all you.
So I think Rebecca gave me the perfect setup when she mentioned that 60% of the people who serve are coming from military families. I think is the stat you mentioned. But basically, the civilian population is. Let me restart. The number of Americans who are serving in the armed forces is on the decline, right? And so that presents an information gap. And so my question, and the question that our group has been exploring, is who comes in and fills that information gap. And so at the University of Alabama, we have a partnership going on between a group in the College of Communication, which is my background, called the Veterans and Media Lab. And then we're working with the School of Social Work and the Office for Military Families and Veterans to try to study what kind of information the mass media puts out there about what it means to serve in the military, what it means to be a veteran. Thanks, Travis. I see a Go UA Veterans Media Lab up there. I appreciate that, Travis. I was actually going to mention something that my friend Travis introduced me to, and it's called the Looking Glass Self. Now, this is not my background. My background is actually as a professional journalist. And then I studied sorry, I'm having difficulty speaking today. Social scientific theory and mass communication at the University of North Carolina. And so it's media effects. So I'm a person who likes to look at things objectively and try to pick them apart and studying them. And so that's the way we've been tackling this subject. But Travis introduced me to this concept, and I think it fits perfectly with what we've been trying to look at. And that is, we are not only what we think of ourselves when it comes to identity, but we're also what we think other people think we are. And I think that's really, really important and relevant for this discussion, especially when it comes to media content, because if you look at the numbers when it comes to the amount of time that Americans spend with the mass media, whether it's television or social media or movies or news, we are inundated with media every single day. And we do often encounter messages concerning what it means to serve in the military, what it means to be a military veteran. The interesting thing that we've found so far is that no matter the content we've studied, we've seen common themes. And so, for example, we did one study where we looked at the Twitter accounts of news organizations in the United States to see what they talked about when they talked about veterans. And what we found was that 50 news organizations, one for every single state, through over 1,000 news stories, they only focused on 3 themes when it came to veterans. And those were ones that you've already heard today. The theme of the victim, like the victim of bureaucracy, the victim of the VA, the victim of service, the hero stereotype, which is a positive stereotype, all veterans are heroes, and then one that we call charity, because that's what veterans in some surveys have referred to as well, the so-called charity case. And these are news stories about veterans who are receiving homes, veterans who are receiving contributions of some sort from the community. It could even be like a free car wash or a free cup of coffee. But the bottom line from our perspective is that you have fewer people who are serving in the military. And so you have that information gap that's lingering out there. And what is filling it is what Rebecca referred to as being very conflated. It's a stereotype, in our opinion. So there's negative stereotypes, there's positive stereotypes. And so we're interested in documenting those and seeing whether those are indeed common, not only in the United States, but also in other countries. And then also we're interested in the front end and the back end of that content. So what goes into the creation of that content, and then what kind of outcomes does that actually have, not only for civilians and their attitudes, their behaviors toward veterans, but then also veterans themselves and that consideration of the looking glass self. If I'm a veteran and I see what is presented in the media, and civilian population who do not understand what it means to serve are also seeing this, am I assuming that they're buying into it and that they're applying it to me? And so I can give you, examples from my personal life that sort of illustrate this line of thinking, where I've met more than one person who doesn't bring up their military service because they worry about the association with PTSD and how that might translate into a social environment. But there's some very real implications of media exposure from our point of view. And so we've been trying to study those and pin those down and see if there is indeed an issue, what kind of solutions there might be to this on the front end and the messages themselves, and then on the back end. And then also, I guess where we can go from here in terms of the role of the mass media and what it means to be a veteran and veteran identity. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate that. We do have time. So if people have some questions for Scott, just raise your hand and I think I should be able to see you, or you could just start talking. That's fine too. John.
Hey, Scott. So I'm curious if, in looking at the media world, you ever look at the advertising that the military does? So I'm thinking that a lot of the advertising, I mean, they don't show supply folks counting a pile of boots or, people, fueling a truck as advertisement. Everybody in the Navy is a Navy SEAL if you watch their advertising. And how much does that sort of impact the perception media wise? And do you know if anybody has kind of looked at that?
I think it's definitely something that we want to look at. And I think about it every single day, because when I drive to campus here in Tuscaloosa, I drive past a giant billboard for the Marine Corps. And it's exactly what you're describing there. And my little son, who's sitting in the backseat in the car seat, he sees it, and every morning he says, "Hello, Marine," as he's driving back and forth. And so even at the age of like 3, he's starting to, this is defining what it means to serve for him. I don't want to read too much into it, which is the reason we try to kind of pick things apart and not overly read into things, but actually like systematically study them. But to me, it's an example of, the potential power of advertising. And I think you're totally right there. There's another, video games are also important in terms of their definitions of what it means to serve. And we've looked at that. And then, basically we're trying to pick apart every type of media content you can encounter, because we are inundated with it every single day. And it's interesting to us from what we found so far and what I've seen colleagues do at other institutions with their own research projects, these similar things are popping up again and again and again across media platforms, across media content, across nations. And so it's incredibly interesting, at least we think.
Yeah, I'll copy that, Scott, because I drive with my 13-year-old and we see military and Army things. And I try to tell him, look, there's all sorts of other things that happen. And he actually says, no, there isn't. I'm like, no, I actually know there's other things you can do. Doesn't believe me. Travis.
Yes, and this question is for Scott or any of the other panelists. I also believe in this notion of the hero and the victim narrative. And I'm curious, have a few curiosities actually. How, Scott, you would perceive the difference between the charity case and the victim, or what I would call the wounded warrior, and why isn't the hero stereotype, given that it's meant to relegate veterans to a silent kind of place without agency, not its own kind of victimization?
So Travis, could you repeat the question about the hero?
Yeah, given that the stereotype actually functions to silent veterans, in my belief anyway, to keep conversations superficial, to prevent any kind of individuality. So it's kind of relegating veterans to its own kind of victimization status.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So when we were going through, we used this process in our first study when we were going through news stories, where we really just documented whether certain characteristics of stories were present or absent, and we took a really methodical approach at it. We started with a few dozen different points, like the story references a veteran being injured, a story that references a veteran receiving help from the community. We just came up with a long list, and then we went through and we documented whether those things were absent or present. And then we ran this thing called a cluster analysis, like a statistical procedure that showed us what lumped together. And then we labeled them basically based on what we were looking at, what we were seeing. And so the difference between like the victim and the charity case, I always hate using the term, but the charity case is that the charity cases oftentimes did have some component of like physical injury or something along those lines. So someone who served in the military and suffered in some form or fashion, receiving something from the community. But then also sometimes there were often stories that were just simple, like Veterans Day remembrances. And I don't want to go on a big tangent here, but that's the other thing we found, is that the mass media tend to talk about veterans around 2 holidays, and then the interest in veterans dips. And so we have definitely documented that in many different ways. I've found it in several different types of media, but basically the interest grows and then it dissipates. And so, yes, it's really interesting because we're still kind of diving into the potential effects of all of this. Like what does exposure to that hero stereotype, like why is it bad? Or why might it be good? What are the actual implications? And I hate even labeling things like that, positive or negative, but what are the implications for not only society, but then also for veterans and people who are interested in serving?
Okay, so that's our 10, and we're going to move on to one more. That way we will definitely have time at the end for a broader discussion. Our next speaker is Dale Mathis. He's a PhD student and a registered nurse here in St. Louis, and he's going to talk about veteran identity and how it affects health behaviors. So Dale, the floor is yours.
Hello. So because I work in healthcare and a lot of health stuff relates to legal claims, to look at the way veterans associate with health, you have to look at a lot of the legal terms, the legal processes that are put in place, and it shifts over time. Some of the things that have happened, bigger things, you have the shift from conscripts, pre-Vietnam, and then all volunteer force. And that's created some differences in the way people interact with the way their benefits are set up. You see the biggest difference between post 9/11 and everybody else. There's a whole large number of programs set up for post 9/11 veterans that other veterans don't really get they're not eligible for, they're unable to access. Another distinguishing feature is the state and federal benefits. If you're Title 10 and you don't meet these very specific requirements, it's like 30 days active duty on the federal, on Title 32 orders without being in a training status, then you don't qualify for a good number of things, to include VA healthcare, which matters to a lot of people. And here recently, President Obama signed some legislation saying that reservists and National Guardsmen could be called veterans legally, but only if they had retired at 20 years of service. And it was purely as an honorific. It had no benefits attached to it. They could just call themselves veterans. And that's a problem, because if you're serving, I mean, it's less of a problem now given the last 20 years of conflict, but you have a lot of people who've been in National Guard and reserves, and they haven't had this federal time, and they think of themselves as veterans. Their families think of themselves as veterans, and they can't access the VA. They don't get the GI Bill necessarily. They don't have the hospitals or anything like that. President Trump came in. He made some changes to healthcare access. Now everybody gets, regardless of time served or anything, combat or any of that. Now we get 6 months of mental health care. Of course, same restrictions that everybody else. There has to be a therapist there, and you have to access community care if you don't. So there's administrative issues there. But this is the first time that's a thing. Previously, if you had a bad conduct discharge or anything of that sort, you wouldn't be able to access mental health resources. Now you do, but you're still in the pile with everybody else. So that's a mixed bag. So veteran identity is positive and negative. It's very complex. How somebody feels about being a veteran can impact how they relate to their communities, how they relate to other people. If you're relating to your service in a negative fashion, you're rejecting that identity. You're rejecting a lot of the services or benefits that might be available to you. Then you're going to have negative health outcomes potentially down the line. And again, if you're positive, you're very much involved with them, then you could have better outcomes because you're more likely to utilize these resources. So I make a big difference between pre and post 9/11 veterans, and it's the pendulum of public support has swung drastically both ways, and you see it with World War II veterans. They were congratulated, parades, all this good stuff, then Korea came along, mostly forgotten, but they were supported socially, and even though they were forgotten, they still had benefits and programs available to them. Now with post 9/11, it's gone completely positive, sometimes irrationally, and it harms in some ways the veterans themselves because it creates that it cleaves that identity in that population, and some people see it as just a way of they don't understand why they can't do these things. But more specifically within the veteran population, First Nation people, they tend to use the Indian Health Service more than Veteran Affairs, even when it's available. It's something that the VHA has to do a lot more outreach with, but they have better access with the IHS, so that's what they use. There's let's see, there's a lot of writing that shows that women tend to get out. Tend to have insurance, they have a physician, but they also have a lot of financial burdens to get that care, and they report a lot more distress, mental health wise, whether related to just the stress of being in that hyper masculine environment and being put off, downplayed a lot. There's obviously a lot of research out there on the outcomes of veterans being mostly men. They tend to be overweight and they tend to use substances. So there's a lot of problems related to that. Veterans who reject who they are or have issues reintegrating tend to become distrustful of society. They become distrustful of civilians, and they start self-isolating. They focus more and more on creating echo chambers that help just reinforce that negative understanding of things. That's true, and that's why the reserves and the Guard have the deployments. That's why they will more likely be able to access federal benefits. But there's gonna be people who can't, and they're gonna be in the same unit, and there's gonna be guys who are Guard veterans who can legally access the GI Bill and Veterans Health Affairs, and then the guy next to him in the formation is not, and that's going to cause problems. So I was looking at a research study the other night, and it had an N of roughly 1,700, and which is a really good study, and as recent as in 2019. But most of the participants in it, roughly 1,600 of them, were white males. There were about 50 non-white males and 50 females who were split more or less half and half, white, not white. And they didn't really go into any other ethnicities or anything other than that. And that's when you're looking at healthcare and just trying to help improve access and outcomes, that's harmful. Like that doesn't do anything for you. Just because the numbers aren't representative of the population, and to include such small numbers doesn't help even the larger number, right? So if you were only focused on trying to help veterans generally, having these smaller numbers didn't help. And if you're focused on trying to help white males like not commit suicide, then this doesn't help either, because it's just extraneous information. So there's a lot of health research that does that, and they will talk about they'll include demographics like that, and they're just not just like statistically relevant. Let's see. So I've got two. Let's see if I can't bring them up. There's two studies here that kind of make that point, that there's differences between ethnicities and how they view their service and how women and men view their service. Yeah, there is some of that going on, absolutely. And unfortunately, like I work at the VA as a nurse, and being a veteran and a combat medic and a nurse, I have a perspective on being a veteran and being in the VA. And I've had issues with them too, which is mind-boggling. All these things are stacked up in my favor, and I still have problems with them. So VA still has room to improve. But there are definitely people who see veterans as like benefit seeking, and both veterans themselves and civilians. And it causes so many problems, because they don't even understand that prior to the 1990s, the veterans didn't have like a transition program out of the service. They were given a meal and a bus ticket, and off they went. And it was only until the 90s that we had like transition assistance programs. Right. They're written for social workers, so they are good papers. It's
Yeah, we're on our time. If you're, we can go to questions if you're.
Okay.
To wrap up.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't even understand like how veterans like are treated. They think the government takes care of them like it's comprehensive from start to finish, when it at best it's like haphazard, and it's harmful in a lot of ways because of how uncomprehensive it is.
Okay. So a couple of thoughts before we go to questions. One, this goes back to what we said earlier, in this idea of drawing lines. And line drawing is a legislative and a policy process, not not something that happen. Well, it does happen in our society, but somewhere along the line you have to draw a line. We can argue where that line is, and I think you're right. That line may be mislabeled right now, and it needs to change. But that was designed around a different time, that when that reserve guard line was drawn. And so let's open it for questions for Dale, and then we'll go to the big group. Okay, so I have two people who had questions earlier we didn't get to. If you still have them, Sharon, if you still have a question, we're happy to take yours.
I think mine's more of a comment.
Yeah.
I'm actually doing research right now. I finished collecting my data and sorting it, looking at not necessarily veteran identity, but it came from a support group I run with veterans. And one of the veterans said, "I wish I could hide my veteranness." And I thought, wow, that's so unpackable. Like that whole concept of that he has this veteranness that he perceives within himself that he wants to hide from civilians. And that kind of is what launched the study. And I think that throughout all the discourse today, we've all been thinking about like, what do we call that concept of veteranness? And I think it's interesting because I think some people define veteran identity as something that's a legal term or something that is given to people based on their DD 214 or whatever that is. But then there's also the cultural aspect of being a veteran, and that there's shared cultural traits about being a veteran. And so I just want to throw that out there.
It's a really a point well taken. And Scott talked about using the looking glass self and this idea of a veteran in a social construct. I mean, on my campus, the Veteran Studies program moved under the sociology department kind of for those reasons. But I'm not sure that like doing gender, you can do veteran. I'm not sure that that exactly matches those type of social conduct. Like you might be able to opt out of veteranness if you do it well. And that's an interesting context. Rebecca, you got something there?
Yeah, I had failed to say this, but it kind of maybe helps explain or something for you to look at. It's unpublished data, or at least half of this is unpublished data at this point from Quantify, which is a super interesting research group in Texas that's looking at a lot of social media around veteranness. And they've discovered that, well, two different studies. One is that male veterans are much more likely on social media to engage in abstract discussions of politics and political identity and political arguments. And female veterans are much more likely to actually talk about mental health concerns and not so much their veteran identity, but their concerns about especially mental health as opposed to males. The other this is the unpublished, and hopefully it will be published soon, is that in looking at thousands, actually millions of different tweets and other social media, in trying to figure out among student veterans specifically, so that was kind of the point that they're looking at, they've discovered that student veterans are much more likely to say that they are not banking on their veteran identity, that they're good, meaning they're not going to identify as veterans in terms of their social cultural kind of interactions. They're actually going to be they're typically less involved in discussions about, once again, politics, once again, sports and others, and much more focused on their academics and their studies and trying to be a student. So that student identity seems to come to the fore with them. There is a definite percentage though that say, no, the most important thing that I'm going to kind of identify as is a veteran. And then there's some who are kind of in between, but that might be something to look at. And I think it's also very important to understand that within the different cohorts of even post 9/11 veterans, not all veterans want to be identified in that way as a veteran because they perceive it as a label and an identity rather than an experience, and they want it to be an experience.
Graham, I see your hand, but I'm going to go to John because he had one earlier. John Summerlot, if you still have a question. If not, we'll go to Graham.
Yeah, so two pieces to it now, but the first piece is, so I work at Indiana University. I'm the university coordinator of military and veterans affairs for all of our campuses. So I've got 4,000 or so veterans, a couple hundred faculty and staff members. We discovered that because when I first started here, we didn't ask about veteran status. Then we started asking about veteran status. And then I convinced them to flip the language to ask, are you now or have you ever served in the US military? And suddenly we had a whole ton more people than we thought we had before. Again, going to that idea that veteran is an ambiguous term. Some folks that were in the National Guard Reserve may not identify as a veteran or may not want that label. And when we flipped the question, we found we had a ton more than what we thought before. And that language was really important. We've seen a similar change when we added a women veterans outreach coordinator, that women veterans were stepping up and engaging a whole lot more because they just simply adding that label to one of the positions made it feel like this is somebody that they recognize, that I'll understand and that I'll work for. To the issue of college students, I've got 9 campuses. One is a selective Big Ten institution, and the rest of them are regional campuses that are closer to being open admissions. My veterans that get into Bloomington, they've adopted a new identity. They want to be a business student. They want to be a Japanese linguist. Veteran is not a piece of their identity. It's just something in passing. But when I work with our regional campuses or our community colleges, a lot of those veterans are struggling to see what's next after the military, and they're in college to try and figure that out. So veteran is their primary identity. And so they're much more willing to sort of identify with those things. And that's one of the things that we just kind of deal with in higher ed. When you start comparing one institution to another, it's like, well, which group of students are you getting into your institution as to where they're going to be at on that range of identity spectrum?
I totally agree. Thanks. Graham, you're up.
Sorry, just busy trying to manipulate my unmute there. I was just interested in, I think, Rebecca, you mentioned that the UK public perception of a veteran is a World War II veteran. And that's not something I recognize, sat as I am at the moment in the UK and working in this field. I just wondered, therefore, where you got that sort of data or evidence or whatever you want to call it from.
I would have to go back in the research and find it all. It's been a few discussions I've had with various people because I was, I guess, shocked by it because it was not what I had assumed. I thought that probably there'd be better considerations in European countries. There is, I would say, a very interesting article actually in the Journal of Veteran Studies. I'll put it in the chat. And it is a whole review of the UK opinion polls and surveys on perceptions of British veterans in UK society. And one of the things I would point out is that they do a really good job of saying is that the difficulty when talking about British public opinions of veterans is that often they're not representative samples. They don't talk to each other. They use every one of them uses kind of different sets. And so it's very hard to come up with what actually does the British public think. And I think that's probably why you have a very different data set probably than what I was looking at, is because you can find them very differently. And the other thing is that when we talk amongst ourselves, a lot of us have very different perceptions than the general public, because we are no longer the general public about these conversations about veteran identity.
Yeah, no, that's fine. If you could post that in the chat, that'd be really useful. Because,
absolutely.
I worry we're going to get bumped. We're not supposed to, but if we do, that was interesting. So let's keep the conversation. I wonder, we have, I don't think we have a hand up right now, but I wonder, did Rebecca come back and Graham came back, if there's something to do with, in the American system, healthcare that changes the dynamic, right? If healthcare is a scarce resource, not saying that healthcare is perfect in other countries, but in our system, it's something to be clamored for and to be gotten based on your service. I wonder if that changes how people think about why they serve or after they serve. And I guess that's an open-ended question, not really a question.
I'll give a quick, I don't know if it's necessarily an answer, but an observation. Is that, and I wish I could remember this article. I think it was a Politico article or an Atlantic. It went to the South Pacific Islands, not South Pacific, Pacific Islanders, which we've really not talked about, Guam and the high percentage rates of service there. And they kind of followed a whole recruitment process, and they noticed that not once did any of the young recruits say they were interested in healthcare benefits, veteran healthcare benefits. The top 3 reason, which remain true through thousands of polls, is a sense kind of broadly of service, of adventure, and of education benefits. And so I think public thinks of veterans in terms of medical terms. Those who serve do not think of them joining for necessarily medical reasons.
I think it's the article is a propensity to serve article, and I have I'm going to grab it and post the link. Yep, Travis.
Thank you for having me twice. I'm obviously concerned about higher education and veterans there. So what do you think about the way higher education treats veterans in terms of creating veteran resource centers and lounges and kind of putting them in their own little corner or safe space, if you will? Does that hinder or help their ability to readjust to civilian society as you would you see it according to your research?
I'll bite on that one. So actually, I have a research study in the chute. Hopefully, we can send out the survey this fall to veterans at the University of South Carolina and ask them about their veteran identity as well as their engagement in veteran-specific resources. So we're interested in essentially, if we were going to offer free tutoring, does your identity as a veteran affect what resources you'll take? So if you have a strong veteran identity and a high regard for that veteran identity, are you more likely to take the veteran resource, or are you more likely to say, I'd rather take the generic student resource instead? I don't know what the answer is going to be. I have some, I suspect I know what it'll be just based on, my experiences interacting with veterans and trying to cahoot them into resources whenever they seem to be, applicable, but some do demur from veteran-specific resources only because they're veteran-specific. However, we do know that there are people out there who identify as veterans. And actually, I put a link to a chapter from Castro and Attell about identity formation based on available resources or capital and those kinds of things, like why it is people are forming the identity they are based on their need.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
Well,
Thoughts?
I would just add to that, of our 9 campuses in the IU system, 3 of them have offices or centers for veterans. 2 of those operate on a very explicit, our job is to help you transition into your life at IU sort of model. And so, for instance, if you show up at our Bloomington campus, one of the first questions you're going to get asked is, what student organizations are you in? And the SVA chapter doesn't count. Our job is to push you into being a successful student, transitioning away from your military life. Not that that's a bad thing or that you have to get beyond that, but we don't want you sort of hanging out here because this is a safe space. We want you going out there and learning and developing and sort of pushing your boundaries. Now, when you accidentally knife hand somebody in the middle of your student organization meeting or drop the F-bomb to the dean, yeah, we're the place that you can come running back to and be like, hey, I screwed up, and we're going to understand. So we operate as a safe space in that sense, but not in the sense that we're not going to push you for development to get out there and get involved and have a life beyond the military.
Sometimes a knife hand goes a long way.
The best thing about Zoom is you can knife hand under the camera in Zoom.
So as we bring this to a close, I appreciate all the speakers who came and presented their work to us. I thought a great conversation afterwards, lots of great questions. We have about 10 minutes or so in the break area till we get to the last piece, and I'm just going to tease it for you. The people, one of our colleagues is going to talk about the conference in 2022, which we are going to have in an in-person capacity with keeping our fingers crossed, some virtual capacity for those people who are still uncomfortable, but we are working our way that way. And I would love to see and have a beer or a cup of coffee with all of you there. I can't close the room, so you have to leave the room. So once you do that, you're on break until our next session. Thank you very much.